Hello, and welcome to part 4 of my talk, The Role of Cognitive Affordances in World Building for Video Games, part of the workshop Embodying Space and Hypertext Fiction through Psychogeography. I hope you enjoyed our discussion, our journey through cognitive science, phenomenology, narratology, and just about every other discipline that you can think of. As I said, narrative design borrows from a number of concepts. It doesn't discriminate. At this point, we have gone through the theoretical aspects of this conversation, and I'm going to take a few questions that have been submitted regarding writing in general, and I'll do my best to answer those. If there are follow-ups, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll do my best to address them there. So I'll read these first before I answer them one at a time. First question is, how do we maximize the effect of narratives in game development? What's the ideal procedure? Do script writing and game programming go together, or does one come after the other? So the first part of that question about maximizing the effect of narratives in game development is really the subject of the first 3 episodes of this talk. We talked about how cognitive design can increase engagement, how we can use recursion, understanding the 3 different divisions of selfhood and consciousness. Those are all the tools that we use to maximize the effects of narratives in game development. The more that we can make a narrative reflect conscious cognitive experience, rather than just linear time, the more engaging it's going to be. And as far as do script writing and game programming go together, or does one come after the other? The answer is it depends. There are a number of varieties or kind of valences of game writing and design that are going on at any given time. Some games are developed by only one person. Some are developed by a AAA studio with 200 employees. I worked for a time at id Software as their principal scriptwriter. And, I was writing scripts as assets were being developed. So characters were being created, environments were being built. So the executive producer was basically serving as the narrative designer and bringing me these assets and saying, these are the elements of the story that we want you to weave together. And so from there, I would write scripts that stitch these things together. I'm not the ultimate writer on that game. That went to a different author. I left the studio before it was finished, but that's just one example of how they can happen simultaneously. Alternatively, a game might be entirely scripted before it goes into development. Now, it's likely that it'll change as it goes, but it can happen either way. So I think the real important takeaway for you there is just to keep in mind all of the content from the first 3 episodes and how you can use that to maximize your narrative. So the next question, what is the difference between scripts for games and books? What are the key elements for the game scripts? Well, key difference between games and books. A book is an sort of aesthetic experience. I've written several books. I'm writing my 6th book now. So I've done both. And a book is a sort of procedure, a process that I'm going to lead you through in a very specific one step after the other kind of way. I'm going to really restrict what you can know about this world based on what I tell you about it. And I'm going to really force you to come to certain readerly conclusions based on how I present the text. Now, a game is much different than that. Some games are, as they say, on rails, which means you're carried through a very specific progression of events in the game. But others are really open, like a sandbox game where you can explore whatever you want. The game, unlike the book, is trying to simulate consciousness. The book is trying to portray consciousness, right? One of them is an artistic capture of the way that we are. The other of them is a recreated experience of what consciousness is. And that's the subject of some of the earlier episodes of this conversation. So I think that we might have touched on there. As far as what are the key elements for the game scripts, they follow a number of pretty familiar tropes, like the 3-act structure in some cases. I'll link some articles in the description of this video that could help you with this. These are articles that I've written in the past about this very topic. But essentially, you need protagonist, antagonist, conflict, and reward in the game script. Next question says, it seems that some of my stories are of the Gothic type. It's my stories. Would I please tell you how do I make Gothic stories relatable for the audiences in your books and games? What are the tricks? Thank you. Well, as far as Gothic, my writing doesn't have too many similarities with the Gothic genre. I guess you could say that if we interpret the technology and the technological experience in the same way that we interpret the spiritualism experience of Gothic literature, then there is a similarity. And how would I make them relatable for audiences in books and games? Well, I try to write stories that are near to what you're used to experiencing in the real world. So instead of really outlandish environments or really alien sort of subjects, I try to rely on what you're familiar with. We talked about this in a previous episode, where that's how imagination works, right? Where you are predicting things to unfold a certain way in the world. That means you're pre-perceiving them before they happen. And when they don't, then there's a disruption. So I try to make sure that the things that you're pre-perceiving match up with how things are actually unfolding in the book. And I think the same is true of a game. And it's not really much of a trick. It's just creating what we call verisimilitude, which is sort of the semblance of reality, to make sure that your story or game is near enough to my lived experience that I can relate to it and therefore be more willing to accept your narrative or your conclusion. Next question. What is the core spatial narrative strategy, and how do we effectively encode and reorganize the space in the process of adapting novels into scripts? Well, that's a highly specific question. I've sort of done this. I've adapted novels into audio play scripts. So that's kind of like a shooting script rather than an actual film script. What you find there in making those adaptations is that a novel includes more information than is necessary for a script. You have to really pare it down. An ideal script just tells me what I'm seeing, who's in the environment, what the environment is, when it is, and then what unfolds as things are spoken. A script is the barest form of artistic capture of human experience because it's going to be played out by actors, right? So it needs to necessarily be that thin. As far as spatial narrative strategy, that actually is determined by either the narrative designer or a producer. When you learn how much money you have, how much time to develop your game, that determines the size, scope, and detail of the world you're going to create, which, as we established, is your primary storytelling tool. So a strategy is going to really be based on what you can get away with, and you develop that first before you develop what it is you're going to get away with, right? So the strategy is the who, what, when, where, how are we going to do this? And then the script and story itself is the what we actually did. So I hope that's helpful. The next question, Dr. Bradley, that's me. I understand that you served as the fiction editor for the easing Farrago's Wainscot. What sort of experience and skills would you need in becoming a credible editor? I did. In fact, I was the founder of Farrago's Wainscot. I was also the one who coded all of its issues and did its editing. I had two co-editors who helped in various genres, poetry and in nonfiction. But yes, I served as the editor-in-chief and the fiction editor. That is a really rewarding process. And in fact, this is a really great question because, often when students are studying literature or writing, you can become kind of hyper-focused and study only that. And so when you graduate, the available opportunities for employment can be tighter, narrower, right? Like the field can be harder. But the more that you can branch out as you go, by the time you graduate, then you come out with a set of skills that allows you to do other things. So, for example, while I'm a professor now, I spent many years in the private sector as an editor, working for various marketing companies. And it's pretty lucrative, satisfying work. So the way to become a credible editor is to start small. The way that I started was, learning grammar, writing, and execution in college, studying it, volunteering as a copy editor for Strange Horizons, the science fiction magazine. After I had done that for a while, I volunteered for a couple other people. After volunteering as a copy editor for a little while, someone who was willing to pay me a small sum for my first paid job. And from there, I rinsed and repeated until I could become a line editor, and then a developmental editor, and then an acquiring editor. So it's really just one stage at a time, looking for opportunities and then growing to the next stage when you're ready, and then establishing a body of work as you go so that others can see your value and perceive it, and then basically reward you for that. And the secret is you have to have a sense of taste, right? So Farrago's Wainscot was a unique magazine with a very specific type of content. It was very specific to the time period of what was going on. And so that was my perspective on the genre, was highlighting which pieces I thought executed their ideas best. So having an opinion, having a voice, having something to say about the content that you're editing really is partners with having gone through your paces and done some work to build up the experience to be able to do it in the first place. Okay, let's see. Last question. As a student who took a diploma in script writing, I was taught to write scripts for short films, radio dramas, and lyrics. So how is it different to write a script for a game compared to writing a book? Do you have any specific advice on a guide on how to write a good and meaningful plot? I do. I will also link that in the comments of this video, so you can read some content there about specific advice on developing a meaningful plot. But let me concentrate on your main question, which is how different is it to write a script for a game compared to writing a book? It's very different. Writing a script for a game, unless you're writing your own game by yourself, is a much more limited environment. You have to satisfy a number of producers and other directors, and often they have conflicting opinions about how the story should unfold. You have to incorporate specific elements and assets that have been developed by others and incorporate those into your story. You have to be willing to change your story as investment and funding and expense changes, and you have to be willing to write dialogue that can change, because voice actors, when you're working as a line producer in a motion capture studio, will have changes there as well. So it's rewarding because it's fun. You're taking these elements and you're arranging them in the way that only you can do as the writer. But it is much more restrictive than a novel. In fact, writing a book is almost more intimidating, because every time you sit down to write a book, there's nothing there, right? It's a blank page. And having written several of them at this point, I can tell you that every time I sit down, I have to teach myself all over again how to do it. It's not, it's sort of like riding a bike, but it also isn't. It's intimidating. There's the entirety of the book to come up with by yourself. So that's liberating, but it's also intimidating. So there are thrills and rewards to both formats, but they are widely different in regards to how much control or direction you have in executing them. And that is our final question. I hope you've enjoyed this Q&A. If you have additional questions, please let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to address them. And I want to thank you for your time and attention for the Embodying Space and Hypertext Fiction through Psychogeography workshop. This has been my talk, The Role of Cognitive Affordances in World Building for Video Games. Thank you very much. Have a great day.